The first time Delia Talbot walked into the Red Mesa jailhouse carrying a tin plate of eggs and salt pork, every man in Harlo, Texas held his breath and waited for Louis Norris to shoot her dead. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Harlo sat low and sun-bleached against the Chihuahuan scrubland like something the earth had tried to swallow and then given up on. The buildings were mostly timber and adobe, warped by summers that turned the air into something you could almost chew. The main street ran east to west, dusty and wide, and on any given morning you could find old men sitting outside the mercantile watching the road the way a dog watches a door, waiting for something interesting to come through. Mostly nothing did. Mostly it was just wind and lizards and the distant complaint of cattle somewhere past the mesquite. But for the past 3 weeks, the interesting thing in Harlo was Louis Norris, and nobody wanted to get too close to it. He had ridden in on a coal-black horse with a rifle strapped to his back, and a reputation that preceded him like the smell of a storm. He was 32 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean through the jaw, with dark eyes that had a habit of going very still right before something happened that you didn't want to happen. He had grown up in the hill country near Mason, and had spent the better part of his adult life doing the kind of work that kept him moving from county to county. He had ridden with a cattle outfit for a while, done some contract work for a land office that involved more guns than paperwork, and somewhere in between he had earned the kind of name that made sheriffs stand a little straighter when they said it. He was not wanted, precisely. There was no federal paper on him that held water. But there were stories. There were always stories with men like Louis Norris. A saloon fight in Laredo that left 2 men unable to walk right. A land agent in San Angelo who had backed down from a dispute after a conversation with Norris that the agent refused to describe in any detail to anyone ever again. A rancher's enforcer position outside El Paso that had ended badly for someone, though accounts differed on who exactly had come out worse. Sheriff Clem Hartley had locked him in the Harlo jail not because he had done anything in Harlo, but because Norris had been found sleeping in the livery stable, and one of the stable hands had panicked and gone running to the law. It was not a legal arrest exactly. Hartley himself knew that, but he had looked at Norris and decided that having the man contained while he figured out what to do was better than having him loose and unpredictable. Norris had not argued. He had simply looked at Hartley with those still dark eyes and walked into the cell without being asked twice, which somehow made Hartley more nervous, not less. That was 3 weeks ago. Legal proceedings in Harlo moved at the speed of the Postal Service, which was slow. No charges had been formally filed. Norris sat in the cell and waited with the patience of a man who had made peace with waiting a long time ago. The town had brought him food twice a day, reluctantly. Usually it was Deputy Amos Pruitt who carried the plates in, setting them down on the floor near the bars like he was leaving an offering at the edge of a wolf den and backing away immediately after. Norris never said thank you. He never said much of anything. He ate in silence and set the empty plate on the floor, and that was that. Then Deputy Pruitt broke his wrist falling off his porch and could not carry anything heavier than a handkerchief for 6 weeks. And the job of feeding the prisoner fell through a series of increasingly unwilling hands until it landed on Delia Talbot, who ran the boarding house on the north end of Harlo's Main Street, and who cooked all the meals for the jail and the sheriff's office as part of a standing arrangement she had with the town council. Delia was 26 years old, and she had been running the Talbot boarding house for 3 years. Since her father Amos Talbot Sr. had died of a fever and left her the property and a ledger full of debts. She had paid off the debts in 2 years through a combination of hard work, careful accounting, and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by arithmetic. She was not a large woman, but she had the kind of presence that took up more space than her frame suggested. She had brown hair that she kept pinned up under a calico bonnet while she cooked, and steady gray eyes that looked at things directly and without apology. She had grown up in Harlo and knew everyone in it, and she was not easily impressed by reputation or frightened by rough edges, because she had lived through enough to understand that most frightening things, looked it straight on, turned out to be something more manageable than they first appeared. When Sheriff Hartley came to her on a Wednesday morning and asked if she could see her way clear to carrying Norris's breakfast down to the jail, she looked at him for a moment. "I already cook it," she said. "How much more trouble is it to carry it the extra 50 yards? Hartley looked uncomfortable. "He's not a normal sort of man, Delia. Is he going to reach through those bars and take the plate out of my hands?" "Well, no. The bars are set close enough that—" "Then I don't see the difficulty," she said, and turned back to her stove. The next morning she carried the plate herself. The jailhouse was a squat adobe building with 2 small windows set high in the wall and a single cell that ran the back half of the room. The door was heavy oak reinforced with iron straps, and it creaked when she pushed it open with her hip because her hands were full. The interior smelled of dust and old smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the iron bars. Louis Norris was sitting on the edge of his cot with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly bowed, the way a man sits when he has been sitting for a very long time and has stopped noticing the sitting. He looked up when she came in, and his dark eyes moved over her once, quick and thorough, the way you check a room you're not sure about before you step into it all the way. She walked directly to the bars and set the plate down on the small shelf that had been nailed to the cell side for exactly this purpose. She set it down without rushing and without flinching. She looked at him the same way she looked at everyone, straight and clear. "Eggs this morning," she said. "And the salt pork. I know the salt pork's been tough. I'm getting a fresh slab cut at the end of the week and it'll be better." He looked at the plate, then he looked at her again. "You're not Prout," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, like gravel shifting under a boot heel. "Deputy Prout broke his wrist," she said. "I'm Delia Talbot. I run the boarding house. I cook for the sheriff's office." He did not say anything to that. He stood up from the cot, and she noticed he moved very carefully in the small space, the way a large man learns to move indoors, but there was nothing clumsy about it. He crossed to the shelf and picked up the plate and the fork, and he stood there for a moment looking at the food. "Salt pork's fine," he said. "It's been better," she said. "It'll be better again." She picked up the empty supper plate from the floor where it had been left the night before, and she left. She came back the next morning and the morning after that. Within a week it had become a routine so unremarkable that she stopped thinking of it as anything unusual. She brought the plate, she said a few words. She took the empty plate from the evening before and she left. The whole exchange rarely lasted more than 2 or 3 minutes. The town watched with a mixture of bafflement and horror. Old Greta Sundstrom, who ran the dry goods with her son, told anyone who would listen that Delia Talbot had no more sense than God gave a post. Reverend Alcott said something vaguely cautionary in his Sunday sermon about the danger of not recognizing a wolf, though he was careful not to name names because he was more afraid of Louis Norris than anyone else in town and had no desire to attract attention. Even Sheriff Hartley, who had asked her to do the job in the first place, watched her come and go from the jailhouse with an expression of low-grade anxiety he could not quite suppress. Delia noticed the anxiety and found it mildly irritating. She was not reckless. She was practical. The man was behind bars and she was on the other side of them, and there was work to be done, and she was going to do it. What she did not tell anyone, because she was still turning it over in her own mind, was that on the 4th morning, Louis Norris had said thank you. It had been so quiet she almost missed it. Just 2 words dropped into the silence between her setting the plate down and turning to leave. But she had heard it, and she had looked back at him over her shoulder, and he had been looking at the plate with the expression of a man who was not entirely sure why he had said what he had just said. She had nodded and left, but she thought about it on the walk back to the boarding house, and she thought about it while she rolled the biscuit dough for the boarders' midday meal, and she thought about it that evening while she sat at the small desk in her room doing the week's accounts. There was something in those 2 words, in the effort it had cost him to say them, that told her more about Louis Norris than 3 weeks of town gossip had managed to. The next morning she brought biscuits alongside the eggs and salt pork. "Baked this morning," she said, setting them on the shelf. "Still warm." He picked one up and looked at it the way a man looks at something that has surprised him by being better than expected. He took a bite. "These are good," he said, and it came out like the words surprised him too. "I know," she said, and that was almost a smile at the corner of her mouth as she picked up the empty plate and left. After that, something shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the way the light changes in late afternoon, gradual enough that you can't point to the exact moment it changed, but clear enough when you compare it to what it was before. The morning exchanges stretched. 3 minutes became 5. 5 became 10. Not because she was lingering unnecessarily, but because he had started talking, a little in the careful, rusty way of a man who has been alone too long, and rediscovered that speech was a thing he was capable of. He told her the salt pork really had improved after the fresh slab. She told him about the boarding house, the 5 current boarders, the 2 rooms she was hoping to add if she could save enough for the timber. He listened to this the way he listened to everything, very still, with that quality of full attention that she had not expected from him, but had noticed right away on the second or third morning. She found herself noticing other things too. The way he stood when she came in, rising from the cot the moment he heard the door, which was a courtesy she did not think he thought of as a courtesy, but which he did unfailingly. The way he kept his small space clean and ordered, the wool blanket folded at the foot of the cot with a precision that seemed almost military. The way his hands looked wrapped around the tin coffee cup she had started adding to the morning delivery, large and work-scarred but deliberate in every movement. She learned pieces of him the way you learn a landscape you're passing through slowly, one feature at a time. He had grown up poor. He did not say it in those words, but she could hear it in the way he talked around his early life, the absences in what he described. He had taught himself to read from a Bible and a seed catalog in a bunkhouse outside of Fredericksburg. He knew more about horses than about people, and he was not sure whether to be sorry about that. He had made choices that had taken him down roads he could not entirely unchoose. He did not say he was sorry for any of it. He did not perform remorse. He simply described the shape of his life the way you describe terrain, factually, without trying to make it prettier or uglier than it was. She respected that more than she expected to. 3 days into the 3rd week of her carrying his meals, Sheriff Hartley came to the boarding house in the early evening with his hat in his hands, and an expression like a man carrying news he wished he didn't have. "The circuit judge is coming through next Thursday," he said, sitting in the small parlor she used for border business. "He's going to look at the situation with Norris." "What situation?" Delia said, pouring coffee. "You haven't filed charges." "I know," Hartley said, and he had the decency to look embarrassed. "That's the situation. Turns out I can't hold him. The judge is going to look at the paperwork and cut him loose." "Good," she said. "You shouldn't have held him in the first place." Hartley looked at his coffee. "Maybe not, but Delia, once he's out," he trailed off. He turned his hat over in his hands. "Some of the men in town have been talking." She felt a cool, precise kind of attention sharpen inside her chest. Talking how? Saying that if the law won't deal with him, they might take it upon themselves to make sure he moves along. Permanently. Delia set her coffee down on the side table with a care that communicated something colder than she intended. "Clem Hartley, are you telling me there are men in this town planning to shoot an unarmed man who has committed no crime in Harlo and is being held without charges?" "I'm telling you what's being said," Hartley said uncomfortably. "I'm not saying I approve. I'm saying you've been spending time with the man, and I thought you should know what he's walking into when he walks out." She looked at the wall above his head for a moment. "Who is saying this?" Hartley hesitated. "Burl Cassidy mostly. He's got 3 or 4 of the younger hands from the Rocking T backing him. Says a man like Norris in a town like Harlo is a fire waiting to burn the whole place down." Burl Cassidy ran a small spread east of town and had appointed himself the town's unofficial moral enforcer for as long as Delia could remember. He was the kind of man who felt most comfortable when he had decided who the danger was and organized his feelings accordingly. She did not like him. "I'll speak to Norris," she said. "He ought to know." Hartley looked alarmed. "I don't think that's—" "It's not a question of what you think," she said pleasantly and picked her coffee back up. The next morning she carried the breakfast as usual, and after she set the plate on the shelf she did not immediately pick up the empty plate and turn to leave. She stood for a moment. Norris looked at her. He had a way of reading silences that she had noticed and that she thought probably came from a lifetime of needing to read them. "Something to say?" he asked. "The circuit judge is coming Thursday," she said. "He's going to release you." "I know," he said. "Hartley told me yesterday." "There are men in town planning to cause you trouble when you walk out," she said. "Earl Cassidy and some of the rocking tea hands. I thought you should know." He picked up the fork and looked at the eggs. His face did not change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. "Cassidy," he said, as though the name had a flavor he was cataloging. "He runs a small cattle operation east of town," she said. "He fancies himself a protector of the community." "Men like that are usually more dangerous than the thing they're protecting against," Norris said. "Yes," she said. "That's been my experience." He looked at her then, a longer look than usual, the kind that was trying to understand something. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you're walking into," she said. "The same way anyone does." He was quiet for a moment. He set the fork down on the plate. "Most people in this town would be happy enough to let Cassidy do what Cassidy has in mind." "I'm not most people in this town," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer and then he nodded, a single deliberate nod, and picked the fork back up. She took the empty supper plate and left. On the walk back she noticed her heart was beating a little faster than usual, and she told herself it was because she had been walking briskly in the morning heat, which was a comfortable enough lie to carry her back to the boarding house. Thursday came. The circuit judge, a thin man named Aldous Webb who wore a perpetually suffering expression and had been riding the West Texas circuit for 11 years, looked at Sheriff Hartley's paperwork for approximately 4 minutes and then looked at Hartley over the top of it with the expression of a man who has stepped in something unpleasant. "There are no charges, Clem," Judge Webb said. "I had concerns about public safety," Hartley said. "Concerns are not charges," Webb said. "Release him." Today, Delia was not at the jailhouse when Louis Norris walked out. She heard about it from Miriam Flores, who did laundry for half the town and missed nothing, who came to the boarding house at noon to report that Norris had walked out of the jail at 10 in the morning, collected his horse and rifle from the livery, and had not immediately left town as everyone had expected and hoped, but had instead walked across the street to the saloon and ordered a meal, and eaten it in full view of anyone who cared to look. Burl Cassidy was there, Miriam said, eyes bright with the drama of it. Had his boys with him. They were at the far end of the bar, and Norris just sat down and ate his meal like there was nothing in the room worth looking at. "Did anything happen?" Delia asked. "Nothing happened," Miriam said, sounding almost disappointed. Cassidy kept looking at him, and Norris kept not looking at Cassidy, and then Norris finished eating and paid and walked out. Delia found she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly. She spent the afternoon doing the accounts and supervising the 2 boarders' rooms that needed airing, and she told herself she was not listening for the sound of hooves heading out of town or the distant crack of a gun, because neither of those things was her business. Louis Norris was a free man. He would do what free men did and she would do what she did, and that was the whole of it. At 3 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the boarding house door. She opened it and Louis Norris was standing on her porch with his hat in his hand, which was something she had not seen him do, because in 3 weeks he had always been on the other side of the bars, and she had always been on this side. He was taller than the bars had suggested. Or perhaps it was that the bars had given her something to measure him against, and now there was nothing between them, and the full fact of him was different. He had cleaned up. His face was shaved, his dark hair was damp and combed, and he had put on a clean shirt that was the color of creek water and shade. "I wanted to return something," he said and held out his hand. In his palm was the tin coffee cup she had brought him every morning along with the plate. She looked at the cup, then she looked at him. "You didn't have to bring that back," she said. "It's the jail's cup." "I know," he said. "I wanted to return it anyway." She took the cup from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. The cup was warm from being held. "How are you finding the world outside the cell?" she asked. Something moved across his face that was almost amusement. "Larger," he said. "Are you leaving Harlo?" He looked at her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression he was deciding something. "I haven't decided yet," he said. "Cassidy is going to cause trouble," she said. "He won't let it go just because the judge cut you loose." "I know," he said. "Are you worried about that?" "No," he said, and it was not bravado. It was simply a statement of fact, the same way you might say it is not raining when the sky is clear. She believed him. She also thought that Cassidy was going to make a mistake if he pushed, and that the mistake was going to be worse for Cassidy than for Norris, and that she was not sure how she felt about that. "I owe you," Norris said then. He said it plainly, without inflection, but it landed with a weight that suggested he meant it more precisely than the casual way the phrase was usually used. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I cooked the food and carried the plate. That's a job." "It was more than a job," he said. "You told me about Cassidy. You didn't have to do that." She looked at him steadily. "I told you because it was the right thing to do. I don't need a debt for doing the right thing." He held her gaze. He seemed to be measuring something. "What would you need?" he asked, and the question was so direct, so genuinely curious that she was briefly caught off guard. "Nothing," she said. "Just do what you need to do and be well. That's all anyone needs." He put his hat back on. He looked at the street behind him and then back at her. "Thank you," he said, "for the biscuits especially." And she laughed. It came out before she thought about it, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and he looked startled by it for just a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she thought was as close as his face got to laughing. "Come back in the morning if you haven't left," she said. "I'll make biscuits." He touched the brim of his hat and went down the porch steps, and she stood in the doorway watching him walk away down the main street with that careful, deliberate way he had of moving. And she noticed that people stepped aside for him without quite knowing why, the way water moves around a rock in a river. He came back the next morning. He came to the back door this time, the kitchen door, not the front, and she was not entirely surprised to see him there. She handed him coffee and biscuits, and he sat at the small table in the kitchen, because there was nowhere else obvious to sit, and she had work to do, and she was not going to stop doing it on his account. He watched her work and drank the coffee and ate the biscuits, and they talked. They talked the way they had talked through the bars, the same quality of conversation, direct and unhurried, without the social performances that conversations in Harlo usually required. He told her he had been thinking about what came next. He had some money saved, and he had been looking at a stretch of land north of town, up near the creek, that the county had been unable to sell because of a boundary dispute that had since been resolved. He thought it might be worth looking at. "You're thinking of settling?" she asked, not trying to hide the surprise in her voice. "I've been on the move a long time," he said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "A man gets tired of the moving. Harlo might not be the easiest place for you to settle," she said carefully, "given the current feelings." "I know," he said, "but running because a man like Cassidy has opinions isn't something I can make myself do." She thought about that. She thought about the stubbornness in it and the dignity in it and the very real danger in it. "Then you'll need to deal with Cassidy," she said. "I expect so," he said. "Deal with him quietly if you can," she said, "not the other kind of dealing." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You don't think I know the difference?" "I think you know the difference perfectly well," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud in case it was useful." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "You're a practical woman," he said. "I run a boarding house," she said. "You learn to be practical." He smiled then, a real one, small and a little slow but genuine, and it changed his face in a way she was not prepared for. It showed the person inside the reputation, the person who had been there all along underneath all the stories Harlo had been telling itself about him. She turned back to the stove before she said something she was not ready to say. The morning visits continued. They became expected. They became the first fixed point of her day, more so than they had been when the cell bars were between them, because now there was nothing between them except the kitchen table and the ordinary domestic morning and the coffee and the biscuits, and those things had a different weight. She started to watch for him, which annoyed her because she was not the watching for people sort. She would hear boots on the back porch steps and know before she heard the knock that it was him, because she had learned the weight of his step the same way you learn the sound of a familiar wind. He had gone to look at the land north of town. He described it to her over 2 mornings, the creek and the cottonwoods, and the way the land ran up to a low ridge that would protect a building from the north wind in winter. He described it with a quiet that was not blankness but something more like reverence, like someone describing a thing they had wanted for so long they are not entirely certain they are allowed to want it. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he said. "It's good land." On the 4th morning after his release, Burl Cassidy made his move. It was not a shooting, which was what everyone had been bracing for. It was something smaller and meaner, more in keeping with the way Cassidy actually operated when you paid attention. He went to the county land office and filed a claim against the Northern Creek plot, citing an old homestead right that his father had supposedly established and never fully recorded. The claim was dubious, the sort of legal maneuver that required a lawyer to fully unravel, but it tied the land up in paperwork and effectively blocked Norris from making any move on it for the foreseeable future. Norris told her about it the next morning. He told her flatly, without visible anger, but she had learned to read the stillness in him, and this was a different kind of still from the usual kind. "What will you do?" she asked. "Find a lawyer," he said. "If there's one within a reasonable distance who won't be afraid to take the case." "Marcus Hale in Cartwright," she said. "He's 40 miles east, but he's good and he's not afraid of anything, including Burl Cassidy's father's supposed homestead rights." He looked at her. "You know a lot about the lawyers in this part of Texas." "I know a lot about a lot of things," she said. "I ran this place alone for 3 years. You learn to know things." He was quiet for a moment. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. He was not suspicious, exactly. He just wanted to understand. She set her coffee cup down and looked at him directly. "Because what Cassidy is doing is wrong," she said. "And because you've done nothing wrong in Harlo. And because I think you deserve the chance to be something other than what people have decided you are." The kitchen was very quiet. The morning light was coming through the east window at a low angle, and it caught the steam rising from the coffee cups and turned it gold. "What do people think I am?" he asked. "Something dangerous," she said. "Something without a future." "And what do you think?" She considered him, the work-scarred hands around the coffee cup, the careful way he took up space, the smile she had seen once that had changed his face. "I think you're a man who has been living a hard life in a hard way," she said, "and who might be ready to try something else if someone gave him a decent chance at it." He was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "That's the most generous thing anyone has said to me in a long time." "It's not generosity," she said. "It's just looking at you straight." He rode to Cartwright the next day and came back 3 days later, having retained Marcus Hale, who, true to Delia's description, reviewed the Cassidy claim and told Norris cheerfully that it was so thin you could read a newspaper through it, and that he expected to have it dismissed within 60 days. When Norris reported this back in the kitchen, he looked lighter, physically lighter, as though something that had been pressing down on him had eased its weight a little. 60 days, he said. "Are you staying in town that long?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "I'm staying." He took a room at the boarding house. She charged him what she charged everyone else, which he paid without discussion. He ate the evening meals with the other boarders, which caused some pointed looks from 2 of them, a pair of traveling merchants named Elphick and Foss, who had heard enough about Louis Norris to be uncomfortable and not enough about him to be rational. Within a week they had stopped being uncomfortable, because Norris at the supper table turned out to be quiet and polite and not in the habit of shooting anyone over the salt cellar. Harlo continued to watch. Harlo would always watch, but watching changed its quality over those weeks, becoming less the tense watching for catastrophe and more the ordinary nosiness of a small town that had found something interesting in its midst. Delia was aware of what they were watching for now. She was not naive. She had been aware of it herself for some time. The thing that was growing in the kitchen every morning over coffee and biscuits. The thing that was in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, and the way she sometimes found herself standing at the kitchen window at dusk, watching the street for no particular reason. She had loved once before, a quiet thing with a young man from a ranch family north of Harlo who had died of typhoid before anything had come of it. And the grief of that had taught her something about herself, which was that she did not love carelessly or quickly, but that when she did, the feeling was very large and very specific and not easy to argue with. This feeling had that quality. She was not afraid of it. She was cautious with it, the way you are cautious with something fragile and important, but she was not afraid. She recognized it for what it was, and she held it carefully and she waited, because some things need time to come to themselves at their own pace, and pushing them only breaks them. On a warm evening in late May, she was sitting on the back porch after the supper dishes were done, in the last of the light, and Louis Norris came and sat in the other chair because there were 2 chairs on the back porch, and she had never said the other one was not his to use. They sat for a while without talking, watching the sky go from copper to rose to deep blue. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the live oak at the corner of the yard. Somewhere down the street someone was playing a harmonica badly. "I wrote to a man I know in Fredericksburg," Norris said, "a man who handles lumber, to get a price on materials for a house." She looked at the sky. "A house on the creek land." "That's the intention," he said. "Marcus Hale says 60 days, she said. "He's likely to be right," Norris said, "but a man can start planning." She nodded. The mockingbird sang, the bad harmonica played on. "It would be a good-sized house," he said after a while. "If a man was going to build it right, room enough for more than one person." The words were very deliberate. She could hear the care he was taking with them. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the last of the light on the horizon, and his profile was clean and sharp, and the expression on it was the expression of someone who has said a thing and is now waiting to see what the world makes of it. "I imagine it would need a good kitchen," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. "Yes," he said, "a good kitchen would be essential." They looked at each other in the blue evening light, and she felt something settle in her chest, warm and certain, like embers that have been waiting all evening and have finally decided to become a fire. "Louis," she said. "Delia," he said. And then they both almost smiled, and then they actually smiled, and the harmonica down the street played a wrong note, and they both laughed a little, and it was the easiest and most natural thing in the world, and also the most significant. He did not reach for her hand that evening. He was not that kind of man, the kind who moves without knowing he is wanted. He was careful and deliberate, and he would wait until he was sure, and she understood that about him and did not find it wanting. She found it, quietly, one of the many things she loved about him, though she had not said the word love to herself yet because she was still being careful with the thing. But she moved her hand from the arm of her chair and set it on the small table between them, and after a moment his hand moved to the same table and rested there with just his little finger touching hers, the lightest possible contact, barely anything, and it was everything. The Cassidy trouble came to a head in the second week of June. It did not come from Cassidy directly, which was how Cassidy operated. He sent his trouble ahead of him. The trouble in this case was 2 of the rocking tea hands, young men named Drury and Pace, who had more whiskey in them than judgment, who found Louis Norris at the livery stable on a Tuesday afternoon seeing to his horse, and decided that the combination of their numbers and their liquor made them sufficient. They were wrong about that. What happened was not what anyone would call a fight exactly. It was more the very rapid termination of two very bad ideas. Norris did not draw his gun. He did not need to. Drury threw the first punch and Norris stepped out of the way of it with a small economy of motion, and used Drury's own momentum to introduce him to the livery wall in a manner that resulted in Drury sitting down abruptly in the straw and deciding he was done. Pace lasted slightly longer but not much. The whole thing was over before the stable hand had time to go for help. Norris walked out of the livery brushing straw from his shirt, and was seen to pause in the street and take a slow breath before continuing on his way, which several observers reported in terms that suggested they had expected more and were not sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. Hartley came to see Norris that evening, and Norris and Delia were both in the kitchen when he arrived, which meant Hartley arrived to find them sitting across a table from each other with the easy comfort of two people who had been occupying the same space for a long time, and this clearly required a moment of adjustment on Hartley's part that he managed with some effort. "The Rocking Tea boys aren't pressing any complaint," Hartley said, sitting down because Delia had pointed at a chair. "On account of they started it." "I know," Norris said. "Cassidy is furious," Hartley said. "I expect so," Norris said. "He came to me wanting to know what I was going to do about it, and I told him there was nothing to do about it," Hartley said, and there was something in the way he said it that was almost apologetic, a man coming around to a position he had been late reaching. "I told him that a man has a right to defend himself, and that if his boys didn't want the consequences they shouldn't have started the business." Norris looked at Hartley for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. Hartley looked at the table. He looked at Delia. He looked at his hands. "I may not have handled the whole situation with you fairly from the start," he said, in the way of someone who has been composing a statement for several days and is finally delivering it. "No," Norris agreed, "but I've held no lasting grievance about it." Hartley nodded. He accepted the coffee Delia poured and drank it and then went back out into the night, and the kitchen was quiet again. "He came around," she said. "Most men do eventually," Norris said. "If you give them enough time and enough reason." She looked at him. "Is that what you've been doing? Giving this town time and reason?" He considered the question. "I've been living quietly," he said. "Which is the only way I know how to give people time and reason." "It's working," she said. "Some of it," he said. "Cassidy is still Cassidy. Cassidy will always be Cassidy," she said. "But Cassidy is one man and this town is not Cassidy." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low between them and the light it made was warm and close. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, deliberate and fully this time, not the careful half-touch from the porch but the whole of his hand, and hers turned palm up without her deciding it would. "I have not been a good man for most of my life," he said. He said it looking at her steadily, not as a confession designed to elicit comfort but as information he wanted her to have. "I have done things I am not proud of. I have worked for men I should not have worked for. I have made the wrong choice more times than I would like to count." "I know," she said. She held his gaze. "I am not blind to who you have been, Louis. I am interested in who you are." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "I am not entirely sure who that is yet," he said. "I'm still working it out." "So am I," she said. "Most people are if they're honest about it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like to court you properly, if you would allow it." She felt the warmth in her chest expand until it was impossible to ignore. "I believe you already are," she said. "You've been doing it all along, I think, whether you knew it or not." Something in his face opened, the way a locked thing opens when someone finds the right key without forcing it. "Then I would like to do it with more intention," he said. "I would welcome that," she said. And that was that, simple and honest and without ceremony, which suited both of them perfectly. He courted her with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything else. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank, the kind that had no pretensions, small yellow things and pale purple ones that he arranged without any artistic ambition simply by gathering them and handing them to her. He walked with her in the evenings after supper, down the main street and back, which was noticed and observed by everyone in Harlo, and which she thought was partly deliberate on his part, a statement made by presence and calmness rather than words. He told her things about himself, piece by piece, not in a rush but in the gradual way of a man who is learning to trust the telling. He had a brother, he told her one evening, younger, who had settled in the hill country near Careville. They did not correspond often, but the relationship was not broken. He thought about writing. "Right," she said. "It's not as hard as you're making it." He looked at her. "How do you know it's hard?" "Because everything you decide to do, you think about it for a week first," she said. "And then you do it quietly and thoroughly. It's a characteristic." He seemed genuinely taken aback that she had noticed this about him so specifically. "Is it a problem?" "No," she said. "It just means I have to be patient sometimes." "You're a patient woman." "I'm a practical woman," she said. "It amounts to the same thing." He wrote the letter to his brother. He showed it to her before he sealed it, not asking her to approve it but wanting to share it, and she read it and told him it was good, which it was, direct and without too much sentiment, but with something underneath the directness that was the sentiment anyway. In the middle of June, Marcus Hale rode in from Cartwright with documents that made Burl Cassidy's claim on the creek land disappear in a way that was legally comprehensive and personally satisfying. The county recorder processed the paperwork within the week, and the creek land was clear. Norris came to the kitchen that morning with the document in his hand, and he set it on the table between them, and they both looked at it. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He looked up at her. "I'm going to build the house," he said. "I'm going to start as soon as I can get the timber ordered and a man or two to help with the building." "I know," she said. "I'm going to build it right," he said, and there was something in his voice that made the practical statement into something larger, a commitment to more than timber and foundations. She met his eyes. "I know that too," she said. Cassidy came to the boarding house the following week. He came at noon when he might have expected the house to be empty, but Delia was there because Delia was always there, and she opened the door herself and looked at him. Cassidy was a thick-built man in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had curdled into something unpleasant through years of small meannesses. He looked at her with an expression that combined contempt and calculation in the way that she particularly disliked. "I'd like to speak to the man you've got staying here," Cassidy said. "His name is Louis Norris," she said pleasantly. "And he is not here, he's at the creek land." Cassidy looked at her for a moment. "You know this is a mistake," he said. "What you're doing with him." "What I'm doing with him," she said, keeping her voice even and her eyes steady, "is my own business and not yours. He's a dangerous man, Delia. People have died, people who attacked him first," she said. "People who had designs on him he didn't invite. I'm aware of Louis Norris's history, Burl. I've made my own assessment of it. I did not ask for your assessment and I don't need it." Cassidy's face did something complicated. "I'm only trying to look out for the communities. The community," she said, "is doing fine. Your quarrel with Louis Norris is personal. I'd appreciate you keeping it out of my house." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hands folded in front of her and her heart beating steadily, and she thought that she had meant every word of it, and that she would say every word of it again if she had to. She told Norris about it that evening and watched his face go through several things in quick succession. The one that stayed was something that looked like protective anger, but underneath it, very clearly, something that looked a great deal like wonder. "You told him that," he said. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't say that kind of thing to Cassidy. Most people are afraid of Cassidy," she said. "I'm not afraid of Cassidy." "You're not afraid of much," he said, and it was not a challenge, it was an observation, and underneath the observation was something warm and enormous. "I'm afraid of things," she said. "I'm afraid of the boarding house burning down. I'm afraid of bad winters. I'm afraid of losing people I care about." She held his gaze. "But I'm not afraid of small, mean men." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and did not let it go for a long time. Cassidy did not come back. He retreated into the specific sullenness of a man who has pushed against something that did not move and is now recalibrating. He still glared when he saw Norris in town. He still muttered to the men who would listen. But he made no more formal moves, legal or otherwise, and the town, reading this accurately, began to adjust its understanding of the situation. August came, and the timber for the house came with it, hauled in from the mill at Cartwright on 2 wagons. Norris had hired 2 men to help with the building, brothers named Ezra and Clement Vance, who did good solid work without requiring conversation, which suited the arrangement perfectly. Delia rode out to the creek land to see the building begin. She sat on a cottonwood stump with her hands in her lap and watched Norris direct the Vance brothers in laying the foundation stones. And there was something in seeing him in that land, in that specific place he had picked and fought to keep, that made the whole thing real in a way that nothing else had quite managed. He came over at midday when they stopped to eat and sat beside her on the stump, which was large enough for 2 if 2 were willing to sit close, and they ate the food she had brought and looked at the bones of what was going to be a house. "Where will the kitchen be?" she asked. He pointed. "East End," he said, "for the morning light." She looked at the spot. She imagined morning light in it. She imagined herself standing in it. "That's the right place for it," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The creek made its small sound in the background, and the cottonwoods moved in a slight breeze, and a red-tailed hawk went over in a long, slow circle. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to say something, and I want to say it correctly," he said, which was so precisely characteristic of him that she almost smiled before she caught it. "Take your time," she said. He looked at the foundation stones. He looked at the creek. He looked at her. "I have been trying to put words around what I feel for some time," he said. "I am not a man who is easy with words. I think you know that." "I know that," she said, "but I don't want to be careless with this," he said, "because it is not a careless thing." He looked at her steadily. "I love you. It took me a while to be sure enough of it to say it, but I am sure enough now. I think I have been since sometime around April, but I am just now catching up with the knowing of it." The hawk went over again. The creek said its small word. She reached up and put her hand against his face, his jaw, and felt the warmth of him and the rough of his shave, and the way he turned just slightly into her hand like something starved for warmth that has forgotten it was starved. "I love you," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." He took her hand from his jaw and held it in both of his and looked at it like it was something extraordinary, which she supposed from where he was sitting it might be. "I'm going to ask you to marry me," he said. "But I want the house to be further along first. I want to be able to show you what I'm asking you to come into. I want it to be something real to stand in, not just a description." "That's reasonable," she said. She squeezed his hands. "But I want you to know the answer before you ask, so you don't spend the next 2 months worrying about what it will be." His eyes on hers were very still and very attentive. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He pulled her hand up to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such quiet reverence that it went straight through her like a bright wire, and she understood in that moment the whole shape of the man, the depth underneath the stillness, the person who had been guarding something soft and enormous under years of hard living, and she was so grateful she had looked straight at him, from that first morning, without flinching. October came in golden and warm as October sometimes does in West Texas, a grace period before the cold, and the house at the creek was walls and a roof and windows and floors, solid and real and smelling of fresh-cut wood and possibility. Louis Norris asked Delia Talbot to marry him on the back porch of the boarding house, a Saturday evening, with the moon coming up and the mockingbird in the live oak doing its evening work. He asked her with a ring he had commissioned from a silversmith in Cartwright, a simple thing with a piece of turquoise set in it, because she had once said in passing that she liked the color of turquoise, and he had remembered, and he had ridden 40 miles and back to have it made. She said yes. She had already said it once, but she said it again, and this time she said it with her hands on his face and his hands at her waist, and the full weight of the feeling behind the word. They were married in November, at the Harlo church, by Reverend Alcott, who had enough grace to be genuinely warm about it, even if he had not been entirely free of ambivalence about Louis Norris for the last several months. The day was cold and bright, the kind of winter day that West Texas offers sometimes as a gift: hard blue sky and sharp clean air, and the smell of frost in the mesquite. The church was full. This surprised Delia, and she thought it would surprise Norris, but she saw something in his face when he stood at the front and turned to see the people filling the pews. Not surprise exactly, but something more like a man receiving information he had not entirely let himself hope for. The town had come. Not all of it with equal warmth, and Cassidy was not among them, but the town had come, and the town's presence said something that could not be said as clearly in words. She walked down the aisle in the dress she had made herself from blue wool and ivory lace she had ordered from the mercantile, and she walked straight and steady because she was not a woman who drifted, and she looked at him the whole way down. He looked at her the whole way down, and his expression was the expression of a man in the presence of something he cannot quite believe is true, and is terrified of doing anything that might end the dream. It was not a dream. She reached him and she took his hand and she looked him in the eyes and she held on, and the ceremony said its words around them. And when it was done, they were married, and the whole church made a sound that rose up to the rafters and shook the dust from the beams. They moved into the house at the creek in December. The kitchen caught the morning light exactly as Norris had said it would. She stood in it the first morning, in the yellow winter sunlight, and cooked breakfast for him in her own kitchen, with the creak sound coming through the window. She had opened a crack despite the cold, and she thought about the tin plate she had carried to a jail cell in April, and the long road from that moment to this one, and she pressed her hand flat on the kitchen table just to feel the solid real fact of it. He came in from seeing to the horses and she handed him coffee, and he sat down at the table in the kitchen and looked at her with that expression he had, the warm, overwhelming one that she was still getting used to receiving, and she sat down across from him and they had breakfast in their kitchen in the morning light. "Good biscuits," he said. "I know," she said. And he laughed, a full one, the kind she had been accumulating in her memory since that very first small smile through the cell bars, and she thought she could spend the rest of her life listening to him laugh and never get enough of it. Winter passed, as winters in West Texas do, slowly and then all at once. By February, the creek was running high from the rains, and the land was beginning to green, early and tentative, the way things that have been waiting a long time start before they are entirely sure it is safe. Norris worked the land, which he had filed a proper claim on as a small ranch operation, not cattle primarily but horses. He had a good eye for horses, better than for cattle, and the hill country to the north was known for the kind of terrain that produced horses worth breeding and selling, and he had an idea about that, a considered week-long idea of the kind he had before he did anything important. He also wrote his brother. The brother wrote back. The brother's name was Samuel, and he was 28. And he had a wife named Constance and 2 children and a small working ranch near Kerrville. And the letter he wrote was full of cautious warmth, the warmth of a family relationship that has been neglected out of distance and old pain, and not out of lack of caring. Delia read the letter when Louis showed it to her, which he did because she was someone he showed things to now, someone he shared the reading and the writing of his life with. And she thought Samuel Norris sounded like a good man who had been worrying about his brother for a long time, and was relieved to learn that his brother had landed somewhere solid. "You should invite them to visit," she said. Louis looked at the letter. "They're 40 miles further than Cartwright," he said. "People travel," she said. "It's the 1880s, there are roads." He almost smiled. "Is that an argument?" "It's a statement of fact," she said. "Write to Samuel, tell him you have a house and a wife and he is welcome to come and see them." He wrote the letter. Samuel came in April with Constance and the 2 children, a boy of 6 named George and a girl of 4 named Etta, and the visit was 3 days and crowded and warm, and exactly what the house needed, which was the sound of people in it. Delia watched Louis with his brother and saw something she had not seen before, the younger, less guarded version of him, the one that had been there before all the hard years had taught him to be careful. He was not effusive with Samuel. He would never be effusive. But there was an ease in him that she had not seen even with her. A different kind of ease. The ease of someone in the presence of their own history, and finding that the history, looked at from this distance, was not as bad as they had feared. On the second evening of the visit, she and Constance sat on the back porch while the men walked down to the creek with the children, and Constance, who was a compact, intelligent woman with a direct way of looking at things that Delia recognized as a kindred quality, looked at her and said, "He's different." "Different from what?" Delia asked, though she knew. "Different from what I heard about him," Constance said. "Different from what Samuel feared." She looked toward the creek. "Happy is what he is. It took me a moment to recognize it because I've never seen it on him before." Delia looked at the creek too. She could hear Louis's voice and Samuel's voice and the high, excited voices of the children, and in Louis's voice there was something unguarded that made her heart large. "He works at it," she said. "Being happy, he doesn't take it for granted." "No," Constance said. "I can see that." She looked at Delia. "You're good for him." "He's good for me," Delia said. "It goes both ways." By the time spring had fully arrived and the creek land was in its full early-season glory, Delia knew something she had been aware of for a few weeks but had been holding close, the quiet, private certainty of it, before saying it out loud. She told Louis one morning after breakfast. She told him simply and directly, which was the only way she told anyone anything, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. She watched it go through surprise, and then something that was almost fear, and then something so enormous and warm and raw that she understood that all his weeks of working at happiness had not entirely prepared him for this particular magnitude of it. He put both his hands on her face and looked at her for a long time. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He stopped, started again. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "This is a normal and healthy circumstance." He pressed his forehead against hers and she felt him breathe, one long, slow breath and then another. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Neither do I exactly," she said. "But there are doctors and there are women who have done it before and we will figure it out." He pulled back enough to look at her. His eyes were very dark and very bright. "I am going to be so careful with you," he said. "I am not fragile," she said firmly. "Being with child does not make me fragile." "I know that," he said. "But you are carrying something I love more than I knew I was capable of loving anything, and I am going to be careful regardless of whether you are fragile." She let that stand, because it was said with such genuine and undefended feeling that she did not have the heart to argue with it further. She was careful in her own way. She did not stop running the boarding house, which she had retained even after the marriage, leaving the management partly to a woman named Eloisa Garza whom she had hired and trained and trusted. She simply did it with slightly more rest built in and slightly more attention to the things that mattered most. The doctor in Harlo, a young man named Dr. Prewitt, who had arrived from Austin 2 years ago and was still finding his feet in the community, was competent and reassuring, and told her everything was proceeding normally. She believed him. She was also glad that Constance Norris had agreed to come and stay in the last weeks, having had 2 of her own and being a calm and practical presence, which was exactly the kind of support Delia found useful. Louis built a second room onto the house in the late summer. He did it himself with methodical care, and the room was small and south-facing for the warmth and had a window that looked out onto the creek and the cottonwoods. He did not say what it was for. He did not need to. The child was born in November, 1 year almost exactly after the wedding, on a cold, bright morning that smelled of frost and cedar smoke and the clean, particular smell of winter in the hill country air. It was a boy. He came into the world loud and determined, and the doctor said he was healthy and strong, and Constance said he looked like his father around the jaw, and Louis Norris, who had spent the entirety of labor pacing the kitchen because Delia had told him firmly that he was not permitted to hover, and he had complied at the door but not at the walls, was allowed in and came and stood by the bed, and looked at the child in Delia's arms with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the world is larger and better than he had calculated, larger even than the land at the creek, larger even than the morning light in the kitchen, larger than all the careful weeks of building something new from the ruins of something hard. It was the expression of someone standing at the full extent of what he had believed he was capable of receiving and discovering that the extent was further than he thought. "He's very small," Louis said. "He will get larger," Delia said. She held the child up slightly. "Come closer, he isn't going to bite you." Louis sat on the edge of the bed and she put the child into his arms and watched him hold the boy with the same precision and care he brought to everything, his large scarred hands making a cradle that was somehow exactly right. "What will we call him?" Louis asked. They had talked about names. They had a list. But looking at the baby, none of the names on the list seemed urgent. She looked at her husband's face and thought about a morning in April when she had carried a tin plate into a jailhouse and set it on a shelf without flinching and looked straight at a man everyone else was looking sideways at, and how that single, ordinary act of directness had been the beginning of everything. "Samuel," she said, "if that's all right with you, for your brother." Louis looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way that he was not going to acknowledge and she was not going to point out. "Samuel," he said. He looked at the baby. "Samuel Norris." He said it like a thing that needed to be said aloud to be fully real. The baby made a small sound. "He agrees," Delia said. Louis laughed, and it filled the room, and Samuel Norris opened his eyes for a moment, dark eyes like his father, and looked at the ceiling with the thoughtful, unfocused look of the very new. And outside the window the creek ran over its stones, and the cottonwoods stood bare and silver in the November light, and somewhere in the live oak that had followed them from the back porch of the boarding house, or one very like it, a mockingbird was singing. The years that followed were good years, the kind that are not without difficulty, but that are built on foundations solid enough to hold the weight of difficulty without cracking. The horse operation at the creek grew into something real and respected, because it turned out that Louis Norris had an eye for horseflesh that was worth money and a reputation for honest dealing that was, in its quiet way, rebuilding something that other reputations had cost him. Men came from 3 counties over to buy horses, and they went home satisfied and they sent other men, and the ranch at the creek became known for what it was rather than for what Louis Norris had once been. Burl Cassidy died in the winter of 1884, of a heart complaint that had apparently been building for years and that no one had known about, which Delia thought was a reminder that the most frightening things in a room were not always the most dangerous ones. She did not grieve for Cassidy, but she did not celebrate either. She thought about the injustice of what he had tried to do, the legal maneuvering designed to block a man from owning land he had every right to own, the way fear and entitlement had combined in him into something that had made him smaller than he might have been, and she thought that was its own kind of punishment, and she left it at that. The rocking tee changed hands, and the new owners had no quarrel with anyone. Sheriff Hartley, who had become, over the years, something close to a genuine friend, deputized Norris to help with a cattle theft investigation in the spring of 1885 that required someone who knew how certain kinds of men thought, and Norris helped, and the thieves were returned to the law without any serious violence, and Hartley said afterward that it was the most efficiently resolved cattle theft situation he had handled in 20 years of law work. Delia kept the boarding house running. She had expanded it to 7 rooms by 1884 with the second edition, and she had hired Eloisa Garza full-time, and the boarding house was profitable and well-regarded, and Delia oversaw it with the same practical directness she had brought to everything else in her life. She still cooked there on Mondays and Thursdays, because cooking was something she loved, and she was not going to give it up simply because she had more help than before. She brought breakfast to the ranch every morning, as she had brought it to the jail, and Louis ate it at the kitchen table with the morning light coming in from the east and Samuel, growing with remarkable speed, eventually joining them, and then later another presence joining them as well. The second child was a girl. She came in the summer of 1886, and she was smaller than Samuel had been and quieter, though not in any worrying way, just in her own particular nature, a still and attentive quality that Delia recognized. They named her Frances, for Delia's mother. Louis sat with Frances in the kitchen on the morning after she was born, while Delia rested, and Samuel looked at his new sister with the concentrated suspicion of a child who has not yet decided whether this development was welcome. And Louis talked to the baby in a low voice about the creek and the cottonwoods and the horses, explaining them carefully and completely, because it was his nature to be thorough with the things that mattered. Samuel eventually climbed onto the chair beside his father and looked at the baby with somewhat less suspicion. "She's small," Samuel said. "You were small too," Louis said. "I don't remember that," Samuel said. "No," Louis said. "People generally don't." Samuel considered this. He poked the baby's hand very gently with one finger. Frances opened her hand and closed it around his finger. Something changed in Samuel's face. Delia, who had not been sleeping as deeply as Louis thought, watched it from the doorway and did not say anything. "She grabbed me," Samuel whispered. "Yes," Louis said. "She's strong," Samuel said with the beginning of approval. "She is," Louis said. "She's a Norris." Delia leaned her head against the doorframe and let herself feel the fullness of it, the kitchen and the morning light and the two of them with the baby. And she thought about the woman who had walked into a jailhouse with a tin plate and looked a dangerous man in the eyes without looking away. And she thought that woman had not known, precisely, what she was walking toward, but that she had walked toward it anyway, which was perhaps the only way to walk toward the things that matter. Samuel grew into a serious, warm boy who loved horses with a completeness that pleased his father to a degree he expressed mostly through teaching. Those long hours in the corral passing down everything he knew in the deliberate, patient way that fatherhood had uncovered in Louis Norris. Frances grew into the still and attentive person her early temperament had promised, sharp in her observations, generous in her judgments, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's quality of full attention. The town of Harlo grew too, though slowly, as West Texas towns did, adding a school and a second doctor and a telegraph office by the end of the decade. Delia was on the committee that established the school, because someone had to be, and she was better at arguing for necessary things than most. Louis donated the fence lumber for the schoolyard, which was the most public-spirited act anyone could remember him making, and which was remarked upon by Reverend Alcott in Sunday services as an example of the transformative power of community, which made Louis look at the ceiling of the church for a moment before catching Delia's eye and returning to the sermon with a studied expression. They rode into town together on the first day. The school opened, in the fall of 1887, with Samuel walking ahead of the horse already tall for his age and serious as always, and Frances on the saddle in front of Louis because she was only one and the school was Samuel's occasion, and Delia rode her own horse beside them. And she looked at the little procession they made in the morning light and felt something so large and complete and right that she could not have named it with any one word. She thought about naming it on the ride back, while the school held Samuel and Frances slept against Louis's chest and the horses walked the familiar road to the creek. She thought about the morning in April of 1882 when she had pushed open a jailhouse door with her hip because her hands were full of a tin plate, and she had thought, simply, "There is a job to do and I am going to do it," and how that simple practical decision had contained, without her knowing it, everything that had come after. She looked at her husband riding beside her, the man the town had feared most, who held their sleeping daughter against his chest with the careful reverence of someone holding something that had taught him, finally and fully, the use of the word home. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. He had learned to read her silences too. "April," she said. "A long time ago." He looked at her, he knew which April, he knew the morning. "I thought about those mornings a great deal," he said. "In the cell, the way you talked to me like I was just a man." "You were just a man," she said. "Behind some bars, it was not complicated." "It was complicated," he said. "To me, from where I was sitting, it was very complicated. You had no reason to talk to me like that." "I had every reason," she said. "You were a person who deserved to be talked to like a person." He was quiet for a moment. The creek was visible ahead through the cottonwoods, catching the morning light. Frances sighed in her sleep. "I have been grateful every day," he said. He said it simply, the way he said the things that were most important to him, without embellishment. She reached over and took his hand across the space between the horses, just briefly, just a moment. "So have I," she said. The creek ran clear and cold in the fall light. The cottonwoods had begun to turn, the yellow coming into them that would be full gold in another 2 weeks. The house was visible from the top of the small rise, solid and real and warm, smoke already rising from the kitchen chimney, because Eloisa had come to see to the morning for them. They rode down toward it together, the man the town had feared most, and the woman who had brought him breakfast without flinching, and the child asleep in his arms, and the one in school learning to read, and the life they had built from the simplest and most stubborn of beginnings, which was one woman deciding that a person deserved to be looked at straight and doing it, and one man, surprised by the looking, deciding that perhaps he was not too far gone to be something better, and both of them being right. And the land and the light and the years agreeing with them. The kitchen was warm when they came in. The coffee was made. The biscuits were on the table. Louis set Frances down gently in the small chair she had claimed for herself, and she stirred but did not wake. And he looked at Delia across the kitchen the way he had looked at her from the first morning she had sat down across a table from him, like someone who cannot entirely believe his good fortune and has decided to be grateful for it every day regardless, because some gifts you do not take for granted. She poured the coffee. She set his cup in front of him. She sat across from him. The morning light came in from the east, just as he had planned it, all those years ago when he had stood on the land and pointed and said, "East End for the morning light," and she had known in the way she knew things, directly and completely, that he was right. It fell across the table between them, warm and gold, the same light as always, the light that had found them in a jailhouse kitchen and followed them here to this table, to this life, to this morning, and all the mornings still ahead of them. It was more than enough. It was everything.